All right, welcome everybody. I'm John Hinderaker, and we are here tonight with Bill Glahn. Bill is a policy fellow at Center of the American Experiment, and Bill has really been driving the Feeding Our Future story from the very beginning. And a lot of the reporting that newspaper reporters and others have picked up on really goes back to work that Bill has done over a period of time now, digging into the real details of this story and analyzing it and writing about it on our website, americanexperiment.org. And this is the second webinar that we have done on the Feeding Our Future scandal. And Bill, I guess what prompts this follow-up webinar is the press conference that U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar had the other day announcing more indictments. Tell us, if you would, what are the takeaways from that press conference?
Yeah, the U.S. Attorney got back up on the podium, and the usual assortment of law enforcement officers and prosecutors behind him, and announced another 10 indictments. So we now have 60 people who have been indicted in this scandal. And he announced another batch of 10 and went through some of the highlights of those indictments and the names and all the ill-gotten gains that they got with the proceeds thereof, and went through. And his theme seemed to be, the song remains the same. It was more people, more houses, more cars, more stuff. But what I took away from it was his closing comments was, see you at the next one. He made it clear that this is not the last batch of indictments. There will be more people indicted. It's just a matter of time. He didn't say when. He didn't give us any kind of indication of how long it took. The first batch was back in September, and then this most recent batch was back, or it was just a couple weeks ago, earlier in March. And in between, there were a handful of people who he indicted as they either tried to flee the country or circumstances pushed him. So now we're up to 60 people who have been indicted in the case. And that doesn't include some peripheral characters who have been indicted in this case and in, say, Medicare fraud, or have also been indicted in SNAP fraud, who were related to the people in this case. So 60 just for the food fraud.
By the way, I should have said before we jumped in that we've got a Q&A function. It should be at the bottom bar there on your Zoom window. And so if you type questions in, we're going to take questions here from our Zoom audience as we go along, and then take some at the end. Bill, in his first press conference, U.S. Attorney Lugar said that they had added up $250 million worth of stolen money. And he said, that's not a ceiling, that's a floor. That's the minimum that we know about at this point. In his second press conference the other day, did he come up with a number? Did he say how many more millions of dollars have been uncovered?
He didn't say how many more. He did say there were more. He was saying that this batch of 10 indictments added to the total of 250 million, but he didn't specify how much. And he kind of indicated, well, maybe we'll get back to you on that. I haven't heard a number since then. But there's a reporter at KARE 11, Lou Ragu, who's been very on this. He's a courtroom reporter. He's been on this case since day one. He went through the original batch of indictments, the original batch of 50, and kind of paired up the dollar amounts for each indictment to count up. And he only came up with maybe 140 million. So by his count, that just what was associated with that first batch of indictments doesn't include all the people. So we're beyond the 250, and he hasn't even the U.S. Attorney hasn't even caught up with indicting everybody from that first batch of 250 million.
I see. So as I recall, Bill, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I recall, there are two main umbrella organizations or sponsoring groups, I think they're called, in the Department of Agriculture regulations, whatever it is. And one of them is Feeding Our Future. That was the name of the organization. And this has gone down in history as the Feeding Our Future scandal, right? But there's a second group, which also sponsored a lot of alleged places where they're supposed to be feeding children. That was called Partners in Nutrition. Am I right so far? Is that right?
That's correct. And Catherine has a photo of their headquarters building on 7th Street in St. Paul, which I visited over the summer. So you have within these USDA programs, there are two programs. There's the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which runs basically during the school year for after school programs for children. And you have the summer food service program, which runs in the summer and feeds kids. And there are these sponsor organizations. They're the middlemen. They're the ones who conduct the business between, in this case, USDA's agent in Minnesota, the State Department of Education, and all of the local nonprofits who operate actual food distribution sites. So there are two of these main sponsor organizations, and underneath each of the sponsor organizations, they have literally hundreds of nonprofits operating what turns out to be thousands of locations around the state. And the main one, of course, is Feeding Our Future, which as a corporate entity dissolved soon after the not the indictments, just the search warrants. After the search warrants were unveiled, the company filed to dissolve as a company, and it went out of business, and whatever money it had left over in its bank account, the U.S. attorney seized. He seized all their office furniture and sold it at auction. So they're out of business. But this other entity called Partners in Nutrition, doing business as Partners in Quality Care, was almost as big in terms of the dollar amounts involved and the number of individual locations that they claim to be distributing food through. Interestingly enough, I was looking at some court documents today to get ready for this webinar, and some of these, there's a lot of litigation I'm sure we'll talk about later, but in this litigation, it came out that the Department of Education had added up the numbers in the fall of 2021 and realized that between Partners in Nutrition and Feeding Our Future, these two organizations claim to be serving more children than actually exist in the state of Minnesota. So there's roughly 850,000 children who live in Minnesota, and these two organizations together claim to be feeding upwards of 1 million children per day, which, obviously wasn't
Bill,
happening.
it's just shocking, isn't it? I mean, how can people who have full-time jobs in the Department of Education, I mean, somebody's got to have some responsibility here. How can they really not notice that they're shoveling money out the door that would be equivalent to feeding more than 100% of all the children in Minnesota? I mean, how can that happen?
Well, the short answer is they did notice. And Catherine has a couple of pictures of a trip I took to Hopkins last summer when I was visiting some of these locations. And this, the first picture is of a restaurant called Sambusa King, which is in Hopkins. And it is located right in the heart of town. Very busy restaurant. When I was there, the parking lot was full, so it was very busy. I assume the owner was making a lot of money through the restaurant. He also owned a couple of other restaurants who are participating in this program. And then this restaurant, and there's another picture of the same building, but another storefront around the corner, is a tutoring company called Shafai Tutoring. And what's interesting about these two locations is they were just named in this most recent batch of indictments. They had never been named in any of these other search warrants or other indictments. But the Department of Education initially rejected both their applications to participate in the program. They had applied originally in April of 2020, just after the pandemic started, to participate in these free food programs, and the Department of Education turned them down, along with a bunch of other locations which have appeared in search warrants and indictments in later years. So they knew from not just day one, but day zero, that there was a problem with these operations, both Feeding Our Future and Partners in Nutrition. In fact, the litigation between these two operations and the Department of Education date back all the way to 2017. These organizations have been suing the Department of Education on and off. They've been rogue operations that the department had on their radar. And again, if you hear the department's defense on their conduct, their oversight of these organizations, they have kind of two lines of defense. One is they got caught up in the pandemic, where the rules were loosened for these programs. Entities that hadn't previously been eligible or would have been turned down automatically were suddenly eligible under these new loosened rules. The fear is, oh, the schools are closed. How are the kids going to eat? We're going to have a whole new infrastructure to feed children. And so they claim that the rules hampered them, and then state government, under the lockdown, you couldn't come into the office. You were working from home, and people were discouraged, allegedly, to go out and inspect these locations in person, do in-person inspections, and check them out and do the due diligence. And they claim they couldn't do that. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but that's one of the reasons why they claim that this went on as long as it did, because all of the Department of Education employees were working from home and discouraged from going out in the field lest they spread more COVID, I guess. That it took a while for them to understand that that little storefront that we just showed you, it can't be more than one room big, was supposed to be feeding 2,000 children a day.
Unbelievable. So Bill, I do want to circle back though. I kind of digressed there, but I want to make sure we're clear on this. So you've got Feeding Our Future and you've got Partners in Nutrition as the two big umbrella sponsoring organizations. Have we got to Partners in Nutrition yet? Was this second batch of indictments? Are we still on Feeding Our Future?
Well, all of the indictments have involved Partners in Nutrition to some extent. So a lot of these locations were hedging their bets, and they were originally Feeding Our Future locations and then shifted over to Partners, or they started with Partner. There was a very vicious competition between these two entities for market share in the free food fraud. So they were competing for locations, they were competing for food vendors. And so there were a lot of nonprofits operated feeding sites under both. So they were partner sites, they were Feeding Our Future sites. And so from the beginning, the first batch of indictments had a lot of individual sites and food vendors who were indicted by the Department of Justice, who were vendors of both. And in the indictments, the Department of Justice is always careful to describe Partners in Nutrition as sponsor A, because they have not been indicted, whereas Feeding Our Future, they just call Feeding Our Future. But it's interesting, in a bunch of state court litigation at the appeals court and district court, that where Partners in Nutrition is involved, they admit that they're sponsor A in all these indictments, but claim, well, maybe some of these unscrupulous vendors put one over on us, but we've done nothing wrong as a sponsoring organization.
So it sounds like neither Partners in Nutrition nor any of its principals have yet been indicted. Is that right?
Well, for Partners in Nutrition, that's true. There is a board member for Partners in Nutrition who is named by initial in the federal documents and by name in the state documents, who they've made fairly direct accusations of, that he allegedly stole money directly from these programs, but he himself has not been indicted.
You know, one of our viewers, Chaz, has a question here on that point. She says, my question is, the board of directors of the known organizations, are they just as complicit? Because there are some big names attached to politicians and law enforcement. How about that? Have the boards of many of these organizations been indicted or brought into the investigation?
Well, of course, Amy Bach, the CEO of the first one, was indicted. She was the defendant number one, as we number these things from 1 through 60. She's defendant number one. She was a CEO. She was a board member of Feeding Our Future. It's interesting, as it's turned out, for Feeding Our Future and some of these other nonprofits, that they had listed board members, people they never even bothered to contact as board members, just because you have to have a minimum number to be a bona fide corporation in Minnesota. So there were people who had nothing to do with the operations of this. But you do have nonprofits where either the Attorney General in one instance or the Department of Education in a couple of others have taken them to court or through administrative procedures, banned them from the program. So there are a number of former directors of the nonprofits that we have named and others who have been banned from the program or have agreed to, in a settlement, to not participate in the program. So the short answer is yes, but other than Amy Bach, none of them have been criminally charged as of yet.
Now, Bill, one of the shocking things about the first round of indictments and the first round of publicity that came out is how brazen these thefts were. I mean, these people would take selfies of themselves holding checks for, $300,000 and post it on Facebook, smiling at, look at all this money. And they would buy jewelry and resort properties and fancy cars, and it's just unbelievable. Are we seeing that again with this second round of indictments?
Well, again, when you're in front of the podium, you got to bring a bigger game every time. So the U.S. attorney brought a couple of items that really jumped out a couple of weeks ago. So we've had a long list, and I've got them written down in front of me, of all the automobiles, luxury automobiles, you name a brand, somebody bought one. In fact, one of the persons who was indicted purchased a Porsche SUV with not with their own money, but with the the nonprofits money, claiming they were using it as a delivery vehicle. So there's that, and then pickup trucks and Teslas and you name it. But this last batch had a couple that jumped out. One on the vehicle list, I hadn't seen this one before, and I don't know if people are familiar with the brand names, but one of the persons indicted in this last batch bought a Freightliner, which is the tractor you use for an 18-wheeler, tractor trailer truck. They bought a Freightliner, and I think it's a Cascadia. I'm not that familiar with the different models, but this is something you would use for an over the road truck, either pulling a trailer or a shipping container across country. So I guess they were going to put that to use, maybe delivering food around the state. But the one that jumped out at everybody was the airplane. So we had a lot of cars, a couple of boats, some other recreational vehicles. But one of the persons indicted in this last batch put down $250,000 as a down payment on a single engine airplane. Now, it wasn't a jet. I know a lot of people were calling it a jet but it was a propeller plane, single engine, small, no passengers, the kind of thing you would buy if you wanted to do acrobatics, aeronautics. I think I'm saying the word wrong, but if you wanted to use it for sport aviation, it's not something you do flying from point A to point B. And they were trying to have it delivered somewhere in Africa. Well, they didn't get to the end of the transaction, so I don't think they ever took possession of the airplane, but they had paid for one. They had paid $250,000 for this single engine small airplane. And then the other one, again, another transaction that I don't think they got to the end of, but one of the people indicted in this last batch had put a deposit down on buying a laundromat. And as the U.S. attorney was describing it, the intent of this was to purchase a laundromat to facilitate money laundering. It seemed a little too literal, but that's what the U.S. attorney claimed.
Very interesting. So given the brazenness of a lot of this was really not being kept secret, was it? I mean, given brazenness of the fraud, there must have been a lot of people in some of these relevant communities who knew what was going on. Did you get tips from some of these folks?
In fact, I started writing about this within a couple of days of the story breaking. Apparently this had been played out in the media for at least a year, maybe 2 years before the FBI raids. But the FBI raids were the first I've heard about it. And I started writing about it because I thought it was a great story, and the local media kind of dropped it after the 24-hour cycle. Like, oh, there was these FBI raids. Okay, well, what's new? And they moved on. And I thought this was a fascinating story. So I started writing posts, digging into it myself. And within a couple of weeks, a whistleblower, a member of the Somali community in the Faribault-Owatonna area, came to our offices in Golden Valley and said, hey, I want to tell you about some people that you haven't heard of yet. And so keep in mind, there are dozens and dozens of names that were named in these first batch of search warrants that came out in January of 2022. And only a handful of those names have been indicted so far. There are dozens of names that are floating out there that haven't been indicted. But this guy came to tell some stories about people in the Faribault-Owatonna area. And interestingly enough, he gave me a couple of names, and with a great deal of specificity. He gave me their names. He gave me the names of the companies they operated. He gave me the names of the nonprofits that they were operating. And he also gave me a list of addresses of residential properties that these folks had purchased recently. And they were known in the community as, middle class, mildly successful people. And all of a sudden they're buying luxury, high-end homes in that part of the South Metro. And he gave me this list of addresses, and I confirmed that, yes, the names of the people were matching the names on the deeds of these properties. And all of the names, all the addresses, all the company names were in this last batch of indictments. So these were people who had not been on the radar of the media and had not been included in that first batch of FBI search warrants, but they were well known within the community. So people who saw their neighbors all of a sudden driving Mercedes SUVs or brand new Teslas or buying lakefront lots, or in one of my personal favorites, the beach resort in Kenya, that all of a sudden they had come into huge amounts of money and had not been particularly successful, middle class, upper middle class businessmen all of a sudden were multimillionaires. It set off some alarms and got on the radar. And so probably the best tips, the ones that have panned out 100% accurate, were people who have come to us from inside the Somali community. It was an open secret, might be a little bit of an understatement.
Yeah. Yeah, and the implications there for is so corrosive of the rule of law, of respect for our democracy, our institutions, our government. Thank goodness these people are now being prosecuted. Here's a question that I was about to move on to, but one of our viewers, Cheryl, asked it first. She says, "Are any of the feeding our future scammers the same ones as the daycare fraud scandal?" But there have been a number of scandals where people are ripping off money from the state government. Daycare was a famous. And what's the answer to that question?
The short answer is yes. And I say that because there have been a number of people who have been indicted by the U.S. attorney who turned out to own either child daycares or adult daycares. And it's been interesting to watch. A reporter for the Star Tribune has been on this angle very in depth the last few months, where if you go and cross-check these names and corporate names through these databases, you can find, and I'm doing this from memory, of the 60 people, maybe 24 own some sort of daycare business. And so the Department of Human Services, which is a separate state agency with a separate set of governing federal and state statutes, has been going through their due diligence, where they have been doing visits of these daycares, making sure they're up to speed, in some cases making sure that the indicted people aren't involved in the day-to-day operation anymore. And they've shut down 3, 4, or 5 of these already, but they have a long list to go through. Now, whether they were committing fraud way back when, we don't know. But it's interesting. The Department of Human Services has taken an interest in these daycares, and in some cases has moved to put them out of business. And so when I was doing my tour last summer of a lot of these places that had been mentioned in search warrants or had been mentioned by name in some of the early indictments, I would run them through corporate databases and Secretary of State databases, and invariably I would find other businesses that were state subsidized, whether they were daycare businesses or personal care attendant businesses or the like, or in some cases medical offices that would take Medicaid patients and Medicare patients. And so we have the 60 indictments, but there's been 1 or 2 people, as I mentioned, who've also been indicted in some of these other frauds involving either the SNAP program, which is the food stamp program, or the Medicaid program, which is a health program.
So obviously this scandal has been a huge black eye, not just for the Department of Education, but the entire Minnesota state government. What is your sense, Bill? I mean, have they slammed the door now on these various frauds effectively, or is money still kind of seeping out from our state government in various fraudulent enterprises?
I want to answer yes and no, that they probably have stamped out 90% of it. If you look at who was operating in these food programs before the FBI raids and who's still operating, in my view of the world, there is still a few operators out there who are participating in the program and getting payments from the state, which I'm a little suspicious of. The main operators have shut down. In fact, we'll probably get to this later. Of the top 5 operators, 4 of them were shut down by the state, and of maybe the top 6, 4 of them are suing the state for reinstatement. It's a kind of an amazing. But they knew who was suspicious, and they moved to shut them down. As I mentioned, there are a lot of daycares and other businesses that are regulated through a different agency, Department of Human Services, and it's taken them some time to go through and do their due diligence and the due process under their statutes to shut some of these operations down. But again, a lot of these nonprofits weren't just getting money through the food program or through Department of Health or Department of Human Services. They were running job training programs through DEED. They were vendors to the city of Minneapolis, the city of St. Paul, offering them programs there. And as far as I can tell, a lot of these nonprofits who are running these food businesses are still operating these other sidelines. So I don't think we've gotten to the end of this process, not by a
Well,
long shot.
that raises a question that several of our viewers have asked. Michael says, are our state officials being held accountable for letting this happen? Gene asks, has the Department of Education done anything to discipline its derelict employees or prevent future frauds? What's the answer? Has there been any accountability inside state government?
To answer those questions, I would go with no, no, and maybe. If you hear, and this came up in the election last year, where Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, and Governor Tim Walz were running for re-election, and media were asking them questions about the food scandal and their role in it and their failure to oversee. You know, the governor is the chief executive officer of the state. He's in charge of the Department of Education. He's in charge of the Department of Human Services. The Attorney General is supposed to be our chief law enforcement officer in the state, and he's specifically in charge of overseeing charities, nonprofits. That's his bailiwick. And both of us seem to have fallen down on the job. And on the campaign trail last year, both claimed that the Feeding Our Future story was a massive success, in that they had turned over a lot of these names to the FBI and the Department of Justice, and there had been dozens of indictments. But you look at the timelines and the time between when the Department of Education first started turning down some of these questionable applications in April of 2020, and when the FBI raids happened in January of 2022, hundreds of millions of dollars went out the door. And they have made various excuses that their hands were tied by federal regulations or state court rulings or courtesy requests of the Department of Justice, but none of it holds water. But nobody's been disciplined. Nobody has been held accountable. The Department of Education, their commissioner didn't stick around for the second Walz term, which is fairly common for a commissioner, a cabinet member to serve one term and then move on to some other role. Hard to put that on the Feeding Our Future scandal. But it's interesting that we're in budget negotiations here at the Capitol, and the State Department of Education wants millions of dollars more in its budget for overseeing the food programs. So for their part, they claim, well, there were these regulations and COVID, and now we don't have enough people. If we had a bigger budget, then maybe we could have done some oversight. So there are literally millions of dollars they have put in budget requests to do the job they should have been doing all along.
Where do you see the scandal going from here, Bill? I mean, the U.S. attorney, I guess, made it clear that this is not the end of the story. There are more indictments yet to come. As we look ahead, what do you see?
Yeah, I see more indictments. It's interesting. We've got 60 people indicted so far, 6 convictions, by the way. So 6 people have already pled guilty and have already gone through that process and have been convicted of multiple felonies. They have not been sentenced. That hasn't happened yet. And this last batch of 10 included 3 more guilty pleas. And so they'll go through the process. And so I expect that'll happen, that some of the people who haven't pled guilty yet will decide, either make a deal with the U.S. attorney or decide that they're not going to be able to mount an adequate defense and plead guilty. But there will be more indictments. When, I don't know, but there will be more indictments, because we know the fact that there have been dozens and dozens of people named in indictments and in the search warrants who have yet to be indicted. And every time there's another one of this batch of ones, they implicate more organizations. And so there'll be a new nonprofit we haven't heard of. Well, the nonprofit wasn't just one person. Usually these nonprofits involve, you were mentioning, the boards of directors or their employees. So this is just going to keep reaching out and out and out until the U.S. attorney has finally gotten to the bottom of what happened in 2020 through 2022.
Is there a sense, Bill, that he's tried to start with the biggest dollars, the biggest fraudsters in a quantitative sense, and work his way down the list, or is that not the way it's going?
That was my original theory, because the ones that were named in the original batch of search warrants turned out to be some of the biggest fraudsters of that first batch of indictments. But there were people in this last batch of indictments that were in the 8 figures, more than $10 million that they had stolen. And so that would have put them, fairly high ranking in the group of 60. So, it might have to do with just the time it takes to gather evidence, bank records, the U.S. attorney only has so many people working in his office, or only so many officers working in the FBI field office in Minneapolis. And so I originally thought exactly that. He was starting with the big fish and working his way down. But, I think it's he's working them through. He's getting through them as he gets through them, and then he's indicting them as he's done. So
So,
there could be some big fish
stay,
out there.
staying with the schedule a little bit more, Bill. So is anybody actually in jail? That was one of the things one of our folks wanted to know. Is there anybody that actually has gone to the slammer for this?
No, the short answer is no, not now. There were two people who were indicted on passport fraud. They were later indicted for feeding our future fraud, but their original charges against them were passport fraud, because in the FBI raids, the FBI had seized their passports, and they had both separately and independently applied to the State Department to have their passports reissued, and they used these duplicate passports to try to flee the country. And so when they were originally arrested, one was arrested on the jetway, getting on a plane to Europe at the Minneapolis airport, and the FBI yanked them off the jetway. Another one was supposed to go to the airport the next day. They were originally held in jail, I think up in Sherburne County, as it happened, for several months. And then those charges kind of played through, and they pled guilty, or whatever the adjudication was of the passport fraud. And then they were indicted on the feeding or future fraud, but eventually both of them were let out of jail. So they're free, awaiting trial sometime later this year. There were a couple others who were thought to be flight risks, who did spend some time, a few days, a few weeks in jail. They've all been released. So the current status, as I understand it, of all 60 defendants, either they're all been released, awaiting either sentencing in the case of the convicted, or their trials in the case of the rest, or the handful who fled the country and will probably never be seen again.
So what's the timetable for the first batch of 50, the ones that haven't pled guilty, which of course is a large majority? Are they moving toward trial later this year, or when there should be a lot of action as those trial dates approach, right? That's when people tend to strike pleas or go to trial, one or the other. When can we expect that?
Right. As far as I can tell from looking at the schedule, the trials won't start until late fall, or at least early fall at the earliest. That they've been pushed out toward the end of the year, sometime, September, October, that time frame. And you're a lawyer, you know how these things go. They never go earlier. They always get pushed back. So and again, I don't know if the plan is to do them individually or do them in batches, or how they're going to proceed. There are a number of indictments, some of whom only have one name, some of whom have more than a dozen names. So I don't know how they proceed or they plan on actually conducting the trials, but none of them are scheduled to start before later this year.
So I want to ask you one more question, Bill, and then let's go to some questions from our viewers. We've got quite a number of them to follow up on. And if you want to ask a question, now would be a great time to type it in. So we've been talking about the legal aspects and so forth, Bill, but the Feeding Our Future scandal obviously has had political impacts. It was talked about certainly in the 2022 campaign, although it didn't seem to make a big difference if you look at the election results. But one of the things that we have been tracking in our polling at American Experiment for the last several years is people's opinions, beliefs about waste in government spending. And we have several times asked the open-ended question, what's your best estimate, best guess as to the total percentage of all state government spending in Minnesota that is wasted? And we asked that question the first time a few years ago, and the median answer was 27%, which I think is pretty shocking. The average Minnesotan thinks that the state government wastes 20% of his tax dollars. We asked the same question again a year later and got almost exactly the same result. 28% of state spending wasted was the median response. But we asked it again recently. I think this is going to come out in the upcoming issue of Thinking Minnesota. And this time, the median answer from Minnesota respondents was 33%. The average Minnesotan now, per our poll, thinks that 1/3 of his tax dollars are being wasted by the state of Minnesota. What do you think about that? Is it your sense that this scandal has had that kind of an impact on how people view their government?
I think so, because you think of, well, what's changed since the last time we asked the question? So what has happened in state government that would cause people to become more cynical or less trusting of state government and its results? And this scandal is certainly top of the list. That's my hypothesis, my theory. Could be other things playing into it. Could be the failure of the COVID relief programs or just the handling COVID itself. But it's interesting. I was looking at those poll results, and you've described them exactly right, where the median voter thinks a third of government spending is wasted, which is just remarkable. And you look at the budget, and you look at how the Democrats in St. Paul want to increase the budget by 20%. They want to jump it up another $18 billion over the next 2 years. So you're thinking $18 billion, well, your median voter is convinced that $6 billion of that is going to be wasted. So you would wonder, well, maybe we should take a little closer look. What I was fascinated by in looking at those poll results are how it breaks down by party affiliation. Whereas you look at Democrats, the median Democratic voter thinks that more than 20% of government spending is wasted, $1 in $5. You would think Democrats, they're the party of big government. They're the party wanting to spend more money. Even they think $1 in $5 is just being wasted by state government. And if you look at, you said it was 1/3 over the all, but if you break it out with independents and Republicans, they both have about the same answer, which is 43, 44%. So, 2/3 of the state thinks that 40%, trending toward 50% of all of our money in state government is wasted. But you look at what happened with the Feeding Our Future, and maybe they're not wrong, because at the height of this, somebody was asking me the other day, how big is this? 250 million, or I think it could be as big as 500 million was stolen when the U.S. attorney's all done with his work. We could get up to a number twice as big as where he started. And at its peak, depending on how you measure it, in 2021, at the peak of the scandal of this food program, $1 in $3 to $1 in $2 were being stolen. So you look at this program and how much money was just being obviously defrauded, and I talk about the wisdom of crowds. Maybe they're not wrong. Maybe they're not too far off on their estimate of how much. Well, people don't understand the intricacies of budget making and state government operations, but maybe the wisdom of crowds is playing out here, and they're not too far off the mark.
To some extent, I suppose it's based on people's observation. When we interact with state government, what impression do we form of its level of efficiency? I think that's probably driving a fair amount of it. Cheryl asks a kind of a sensitive question here. I want to get your bounce on. She says, most, if not all, were Somali immigrants. Did that not send up a red flag that this group was dominating the sites? Again, maybe you could comment on that, Bill, whatever way you think is appropriate. I mean, I think everybody understands that a lot of this fraud, not all of it by any means, but a lot of it was centered in the Somali community. What's going on there?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, if you look through the list of 60 names, a lot of them have obvious origins in East Africa. They're not all Somalians. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds of Somalians versus Ethiopians versus some other ethnicity. But the interesting, if you look at the list that Sahan Journal keeps a running list of everybody who's been indicted. Name number 1 is Amy Bach. Name number 60 is Sharon Ross. So it's not true that they're all Somalian. There's Sharon Ross happens to, I would guess she identifies as African American, and Amy Bach is, I would describe her as a blonde white woman, and she's supposed to be the ringleader of this. But you've heard the charges of racism and all the litigation that these entities have engaged in with state government, whether it's in state courts or federal courts. The theme of claiming racism has been fairly consistent. That they say, well, we've done nothing wrong. It's the state government has it in for filling the ethnicity, whichever ethnicity happens to be involved in this. But it's interesting from my perspective in that the vast majority of people who have contacted me with information on this case, naming names, giving me addresses, giving me tips, have been from inside the Somali community. So I know from my direct observation, there is no group of people more upset with this scandal than the people inside the Somali community who see it happening all around them. And again, to put it in perspective, and somebody was asking me a similar question on the phone the other day. I've seen estimates of the Somali population in Minnesota very widely, but kind of the mean estimates kind of center between 80,000 to 100,000 people. So there could be 100,000 Somalians or people of Somalian descent who live in Minnesota. And the number of people involved in this scandal, we're up to 60 indictments, not all of whom are Somalian, I estimate is probably between about 300 and 500 people. So that's an astounding number of people who stole an astoundingly large amount of money from state and federal governments, for sure. A conspiracy involving hundreds of people and hundreds of millions of dollars is massive. But when you compare it to the entire population of that community in the state, it's rounding error down to zero. So this is a very small group of people, and people are asking about the other scandal involving the daycare, and in many instances, the exact same people. So this is a small group of people who happen to be Somali. You know, I compare it to, say, my favorite gangster movies of the 1920s and 30s, depicting Italian Americans living in New York. Millions and millions of people of Italian descent in the greater New York area. The number who are involved in mafia activities, you could fit in a room. So, you know, we've had the same issue with people saying, oh, this casts aspersions on the Italian American community. But if you look at the numbers and step back a few feet, you know, it's a small group of a small group. So, you know, it's hard to draw any conclusions about the larger group.
Excellent. One of our viewers, Scott, asks, were any meals actually served by either entity? And I think you at least implicitly answered that, but it's a great question. Did some kids get fed here?
Yes, and in fact, Catherine has, on my last picture, we dispatched one of our colleagues over to St. Paul who took a photo of one of the nonprofits who was in the news because a local state senator went to bat for her nonprofit. Her nonprofit got cut off by the Department of Education because the Department of Education said they weren't following all the rules, and our colleague went over there and took this picture. So at least they were giving away some amount of food. Now, if you read, this person is in Sharon Ross, who was indicted as a defendant number 60. The Department of Justice claims that she took millions of dollars out of the program and did not deliver millions of dollars worth of food. But it's fairly clear from eyewitness testimony that this location was distributing food, just not in the scope of which they were billing the state. So again, if you hear the U.S. attorney and read the indictments carefully, there were some people they describe as never serving a meal, but there were some people, a lot of these restaurants who were indicted were described as they served some meals, but nothing like the volume they claimed to be serving. So, you know, there weren't millions of children being served or 1 million children being served, but there were probably thousands of children being served. So some of these operations were not small in the grand scheme of things, but orders of magnitude smaller than what they were billing for.
Another question from one of our viewers, will this hopefully improve the process to become a real nonprofit and not just money laundering schemes? How about that, Bill? Are we seeing any process-related reforms in the works, either administratively or legislatively?
Well, again, along with the extra millions the Department of Education wants to do more due diligence, there has been some talk at the Capitol of maybe doing more vetting of these organizations. But again, the nonprofit industrial complex, if you will, is well organized and well lobbied, and there are tens of thousands of nonprofits registered in the state and several thousand that are in active business, and they've been actively discouraging people from changing the rules. And I've personally advocated for a bifurcation. We have a lot of organizations in Minnesota and other states who are doing good work. The Red Cross whenever there's a disaster, the Salvation Army with their collection efforts, the March of Dimes, lots of bona fide charities doing excellent work helping people. And then you have another group of nonprofits who register as nonprofit corporations who exist solely to tap federal or state money. So they're not getting donations from the general public. They're not doing telethons or fundraisers or kettles in front of the grocery store. They're doing grant applications and getting in state programs and taking taxpayer money. And I think that's where we should make the distinction, that if you're doing charitable work and taking money from you or I, the private sector people, to do good work, go do good work, and we'll regulate you on that basis. But if you are solely existing to tap taxpayer money, we should have a different level of scrutiny for those sort of organizations. And that's what these ladders are. There were a few that were doing other charitable work, but the vast majority of the ones who were indicted were ones who were incorporated and claimed to be serving thousands of children within days of incorporation, or in some cases claiming to be serving thousands without having bothered to be incorporated. So they were obviously created for this scam purpose and received no scrutiny. You know, the IRS is pretty perfunctory. If you applied to be a nonprofit, you filled out your paperwork, they approve your application. So, but I think if you exist to be a quasi-governmental agency, then you need to be scrutinized.
Another viewer named Lynn asks an interesting question. Now that we are going to feed breakfast and lunch to all the children in Minnesota, what do we need to do to prevent this type of fraud for this program? And I think she's talking about, there's legislation now, Bill, you're more up on this than I am, but apparently parents no longer have any responsibility to feed their children. Is that what we're now doing in Minnesota?
Correct. So this is, I find, mildly amazing that the first reaction of state government, or at least the Democrats in state government, to this, what I think is a $500 million scandal, is to double down. Coincidentally, the dollar amount of this program is something like the $250 million that the Department of Justice claims was stolen. This is the cost of the new program. And so what they are going to do is give enough money to public schools, whether they're regular public schools or charter schools, to feed every child in attendance, regardless of their family's income. So if you're a multi-millionaire, or you're a billionaire, and you send your kids to public school, they get the free lunch just like everyone else, to remove the stigma, allegedly, of the ones who had gotten the free lunch. We had lots of programs around to provide these free lunch, but you wonder, well, now that we have that, now that we have money for schools to feed every child in Minnesota breakfast and lunch, or at least all public school children breakfast, what do we need these other programs for? Why do we still have the child and adult care food program? Why do we still have the summer food service program when the state government has said we're going to use state dollars, not federal dollars, to do the same thing? It seems completely redundant.
A viewer named Bridget asks a good question here. How much money / property has been recovered thus far? Because I think the feds have been pretty aggressive in going after and repossessing, or taking custody of cars and real estate and so forth. Do you have a sense of what that adds up to out of these hundreds of millions? How much have we gotten back?
Yeah, I remember when he stepped up to the microphone the first time, he gave a number out of the 250 million that he had recovered, about 50 million. So he recovered about a quarter, if I'm doing the math, is that a fifth of the money that had been lost. The number I recall him saying at the podium this time, Andy Luger got up and said something like 66 million, 67 million he'd been recovered. And the recovery is literally that. There were some people who have been indicted who have pled not guilty, but because forfeiture is a separate civil procedure, have signed over the deeds to office buildings, lots of residential real estate, homes, condos, empty lots. There have been, I mentioned the office buildings, there have been apartment buildings, there have been commercial properties seized. There have been efforts to seize some of these properties overseas, including that beach resort, but there are condos in Turkey, condos and office buildings in Kenya. Money was sent to China. There was money put into cryptocurrency. But then some of these nonprofits had bank accounts. The U.S. attorney seized their bank accounts, or in some cases, when they searched their cars and homes, there was cash just lying around, and that was seized. So they have been very aggressive in going through the forfeiture statutes and getting a lot of this done. And even in the absence of convictions, have gotten some of the defendants to agree in civil proceedings to hand over this property. Just an amazing list of cars and trucks and boats and homes, condos, you name it. But a lot of the money was spent on handing out cash to relatives and friends, paying credit card bills, paying mortgages. The mortgages, they could seize the house, but then if they were just paying rent and that money's gone, or if it was sent to China or Turkey, we'll probably never see it again.
Laura asked an interesting question too. She says, do people get deported for crimes such as this after serving time? Now, many of these people, I assume, are American citizens, but have the immigration laws been a factor here? What's the story there?
I don't think so. In looking through the indictments, and it's not 100% clear, but as far as I can tell, everybody who's been indicted who is still in America is an American citizen. And it's interesting that of the 60 people, some of the people who have been indicted are very young. There's a 21-year-old and some other people who are in their early 20s who have been indicted. And I think it's highly likely they were born in America and were natural born American citizens. But I believe of the other dozens, they are all naturalized American citizens. And other than the passport fraud thing, I haven't heard of anything involving say fraudulent entry into the US or anything that could be grounds for deportation. So I don't think that's going to be part of this story at all, except for those handful of people who fled could well be deported back to America to stand trial.
Yeah. Bonnie asks a question that you could probably spend a lot of time on. We won't, but I'd like to get your thoughts on it. Bonnie asks, why aren't any mainstream media reporters reporting on this fraud? Well, I think some of them have, but comment on that if you would, Bill. What do you think about the quality of the so-called mainstream reporting on this scandal?
Well, that's why I got involved, because I thought this was a big story and it could have a lot of different elements to it that would be profitable to look into, and people weren't. They all reported the FBI raids on day one and had a follow-up story on day two, and then it just completely dropped off the radar. Now, that being said, there have been some outlets who have been very aggressive in breaking stories and going after a lot of the political angles, where some politicians, we haven't named any names, but some politicians who have been linked to the story, either in helping them with the bureaucracy or in fact running nonprofit operations themselves in a couple of cases. So the Star Tribune has had a couple of reporters who have done great work. I mentioned Lou Ragoo of KARE 11. There have been some other reporters who have reported on this. There's been some other than us, Alpha News and a couple of other alternative publications. Sahan Journal does a lot of work inside the Somali community and reporting on events there. They've been very aggressive in pursuing the story, even though it might not reflect
actually,
well.
I think my sense is they're a pretty good news outlet. They've really been on this story.
They have broken a lot of news. And then Minnesota Reformer, who might not be particularly sharing our political viewpoint, have had some stories where their reporter has broken a lot of news and uncovered new ground. So it's been the alternative press, our organization, Alpha News on kind of on the right, and then Sahan Journal and Minnesota Reformer maybe leaning the other direction, but a bunch of different outlets, and I'll call out KARE 11 and Star Tribune as breaking news and staying on this and reporting throughout the interval, not just when there's an indictment, but every couple of months checking in on some of this litigation. Is a very litigious group. A lot of litigation going on in state courts, some in federal courts, and they'll report on new developments there. But again, I attribute it to, we have a shrinking news supply in the state. Newsrooms are much smaller than they were even just a few years ago. There just isn't the manpower. More news even today than we can profitably cover. And it's the pull of the new. There is some new big story that they want to follow and find a local angle to. And this thing has literally been going on for years. And I'll report on stuff, but if you're waiting for the next indictment or waiting for the next guilty plea, then there could be weeks or months that go on in between. But again, it probably has the wrong names attached to it. That could be part of it, but it's just part of we just don't have the news infrastructure that we had even before the pandemic.
Michael asked a question that I'm glad he asked it, because it's one that I've heard a lot, and I want to give you a chance to comment on it. He asked, is it possible that anyone within the Department of Education had any direct knowledge of this fraud?
It's, I want to split that question in half, because I mentioned a couple of examples and we showed pictures where employees at the Department of Education knew that these organizations were questionable. They knew they weren't following the rules and had been pursuing them for many years. I think what the question is trying to get at is, was there anybody inside these organizations who was complicit? And I have never seen any evidence of that. You can attribute some of this to, lack of ambition or just, I hate to use the word laziness, but just not being on top of it, not being diligent, or running into obstacles, or we've talked offline some about how the department was often out-lawyered in some of these court cases. And I think there was some thoughts, well, we tried, we failed, we gave it to the FBI, we're washing our hands of it. I haven't seen any evidence anybody inside these state agencies was complicit, but again, they have a lot to answer to. They knew who was doing this, they knew it from the beginning, but they were unable to stop it. And now that we have indictments is not evidence of their success, but the fact that $250, $500 million went out the door on their watch is a sign of their failure.
Tom's got a question. Have any of the indictments thus far involved entities located in St. Cloud or the St. Cloud area? What's the answer to that?
The short answer is yes. So I'm trying to think and not thinking of any of the indictments that centered on St. Cloud, but a lot of the nonprofits who have been indicted claim to have, or perhaps actually had, bona fide operations in St. Cloud. So some of these organizations, certainly the umbrella ones, the Feeding Our Future and Partners in Nutrition, they had operations all over the state. But some of the subsidiary nonprofits that have been indicted claim to have been running operations in St. Cloud. And I did mention one person. He was actually indicted, pled guilty. He's been convicted of SNAP fraud, the fraud involving food stamps. He has operated allegedly a food distribution site through some of his corporate entities. He was indicted and convicted of SNAP fraud. He has not been indicted on fraud related to Feeding Our Future, but his operations were all in St. Cloud.
Bill, we've got time for just a couple of real quick questions and answers before we're going to have to go. Gene wants to know, assuming a conviction of major fraud, what type of sentence could be expected? Do you have a feel for that?
I don't, because I don't really know this area of the law. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I've heard people say, oh, maybe 3 years, maybe more. But then you see so many people, and I've followed some federal cases where they get convicted and then it's probation, or they could get convicted and the sentence is stayed. So I could imagine anything from people getting 3 years, 5 years, more. So, some of them have been accused of stealing tens of millions of dollars. You would hope they would result in some prison time, but I just don't have a good feel for it. It could end up with the slap on the wrist. I have more faith in federal court than I do state court, but we'll see.
So we're bumping up against an hour here, and I want to adjourn here in view of that fact. Bill, thank you so much for doing this. And thanks to all of our viewers for participating. This will be posted online. People will be able to watch it after the fact. I want to close with one last question, Bill. That's from one of our attendees who says, Bill, are your articles from the first to most recent on the American Experiment website?
They are, of course, and I'll tweet out a link to it. So I have a tag where I've collected all of the articles I've written for the last year plus under a single tag, and you can see all of it on there. And John, I wanted to thank my nationwide audience. We have people from coast to coast watching this tonight, and I would encourage other people to watch it again on YouTube.
All right, thank you all very much for participating, and have a great night.